Hey everybody, it's Lucas. Today, we're reviewing Best Served Cold by Joe Abercrombie, first published in 2009 and the first of standalone sequels to the First Law trilogy. But before I actually get into the review for it, because my channel is somewhat new and I haven't covered the First Law yet, I kind of want to just give my quick impressions on the series as a whole so far. I love the original trilogy. I think the first book is a great start. I think a lot of people kind of complain about the Blade itself not really having much of a plot, but I just love all the characters so much that it just never really bothered me. I was completely into the book the entire time. I think Glocta's story and Before They're Hanged is one of my favorite subplots in the entire series. The journey that Logan and Baez and the whole crew go on is, I thought it was great. I love the ending of the second book. Last Argument of Kings is my favorite of the trilogy. I just think just so much respect for what Joe Abercrombie did in that book. I love the ending of The Last Argument of King. All the plot lines just completely hit for me. I don't really have a lot to complain about with The Last Argument of Kings. It's one of my favorite fantasy novels of all time. The trilogy's probably up there with my favorite trilogies as well. If I had to come up with any sort of relative complaint, it would probably be that the highs just aren't as high as I've seen in some other series. It's lacking in scope a little bit, which is honestly kind of the intent in a lot of ways and something that I really appreciated when I read it. So yeah, I mean, obviously I like this series a lot, which is why I think it's interesting going back to Best Served Cold that Joe kind of takes this opportunity at this point in the series to address his lack of focus on world building to create a standalone novel that's still placed in the same universe to kind of expand on an area that's been referenced in the trilogy, but has not been a focus and not been an area that we've explored yet. And that land is called Styria, and Styria consists of several city-states at war with one another, one of which is Talon, ruled by the Grand Duke Orso, who, if you've read the original trilogy, is a character that is mentioned within the books, but never actually appears. So in Best Served Cold, he is one of the characters, not one of the main characters, but he's kind of the impetus of the plot, which is that he attempts to have a mercenary general serving under him assassinated, her name, Monza Mercado. And don't worry, this is all within the first chapter, so we're not getting into spoilers yet, but through some miracle, ends up surviving, of course, because she's the main character. And the rest of the book is just about her trying to assemble a crew of people to get revenge on all the people that she's been betrayed by. Now, a quick point I want to touch on before we continue on with the video is whether you can read Best Served Cold before reading the first 3 books in the series. I'm going to put myself in the camp that strongly recommends that you don't for a couple of reasons. First, you're getting spoiled on some of the background of the characters. Most of the characters in Best Served Cold are original characters that have not appeared in the series up until this point. But there are several characters that are fairly prominent in the original series that return. And you're kind of spoiling yourself for what their backgrounds are, some of the character development that goes on up until this point, and then also just the fact that they're alive. And the second reason is that you're missing out on some world building that happens. I think it was cool to see the difference of expectations between what Styria was like, between what was mentioned in the First Law trilogy up until Best Served Cold. And there's some stuff that happens in between the original trilogy and Best Served Cold, some world building elements that are introduced within Best Served Cold that I don't think would land as much, if not for, the audience having read everything up until that point. There's also some plot beats that happen that are fairly vague in that they wouldn't spoil going back to what's happening in the original series, but I would say that they're more of a payoff for people that have read the original series and kind of see the references that are going on to Best Served Cold that somebody who's new to the series wouldn't quite get. The third reason is the First Law is great. Like, why don't you want to read it? Now that I've kind of gotten that out of the way, I'd highly recommend, if you haven't read the original series, to stop watching the video at this point, because I'm going to say things that could be regarded as spoilers for the original series. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, what did I think about Best Served Cold? I liked the book, but it's definitely my least favorite in this series up until this point. And I'm going to try to get the reasons why in a short, vague, non-spoilery way Then I'll kind of hit in a spoiler section the more detailed responses for why I didn't enjoy this book as much as I enjoyed the original series. Let's start with the plot. I think this book gets sold by people online a lot as fantasy Kill Bill, and I actually think that's a pretty apt description. For those who don't know, Kill Bill, Tarantino movie from the early 2000s, released in 2 parts, follows a woman just like in Best Served Cold that's trying to get revenge on the people that assassinated her. I think the similarities more specifically have to do with the structure of the story and how it's several different parts with the main character finding one of the people that betrayed him, and it's kind of just a mini story of how they managed to get revenge on, or try to get revenge on, each individual person. I think the main difference between Kill Bill and Best Served Cold is that Kill Bill is very much about the woman, the main character in Kill Bill, getting revenge on the characters, while Best Served Cold is more of that fantasy ensemble with a group of characters that Monza hires early on in the book. And it's kind of the story of how they clash and interact with one another while still trying to get each individual mission done. And that's where you get into what Abercrombie is iconic for, which is his characters. And these interactions are just so great throughout the story, getting to hear the characters talk to one another, getting to hear their inner monologues as they kind of interpret what the other people are saying to them and their inner feelings about how they feel about each other character individually. It's what makes him so special as an author, and it's really on full display in this book. I do think in a lot of ways, though, sometimes the supporting cast of this story kind of overshadows Monza's plot arc and her character as a whole. Looking back at the original trilogy, I think a lot of people, myself included, thought that Pharaoh was probably their least favorite character in the story. And I think a big part of why people dislike Pharaoh so much was the lack of development that her character has, and you don't really build any emotional connection with her throughout the series like you do for some of the other characters. And unfortunately, the difference between Pharaoh and Monza is that I only had to read Pharaoh's perspective every once in a while, and then I can go back to other characters who had more significant plot lines within the story. Monza's supposed to be the main character in the story, and I just didn't find myself that interested in her character as a whole, and therefore not really that interested in what her plot was and how she ends up developing throughout the rest of the story. I think part of my disappointment with her character arc, and really some of the other character arcs that I'm not going to get into, have to do with the fact that I think the story's a little bit too long and repetitive. It's about the same length as Last Argument of Kings, but I don't feel like nearly as much of impact happens in this book as there was in the last book. Personally, it was a little bit of a limping to the finish line kind of situation where by the end of the book, I was pretty happy that it was over. Now, even though I have a lot of problems with this book, it's still a First Law book. You know, Joe Abercrombie is just too good of a writer for me to think anything less than, at the very least, that this is a good book. And even though this book was a slight disappointment for me, I can see this being one of those books that's fairly divisive. Coming off of the original series, it's just such a big deviation from what we've come to expect so far that I think I can see some people really disliking this book, but I can also see a lot of people absolutely loving this book. I wouldn't be surprised if somebody said this was their favorite in the series up until this point. And if you're somebody that is maybe thinking about skipping the standalones because you want to read the sequel trilogy, I just want to bring up one last point, and that's that I feel like there's a lot of stuff in this book in terms of world building that's set up for later books. Going into this as a standalone, I kind of expect a self-contained story, and I think in a lot of aspects you can read this book by itself and be satisfied with it. But there's a lot of stuff that I'm expecting is going to be foreshadowed, or was foreshadowed in this book, that is going to be paid off probably in the sequel trilogy, that I'm really looking forward to reading and looking back and seeing how he kind of set it up in these standalones. So yeah, that'll do it for my non-spoiler section for this book. I'd give it a 3.5 out of 5. My least favorite in the series, I would go Best Served Cold, Blade Itself, Before They're Hanged, and Last Argument of Kings. Okay, now it's time for some spoilers. The first thing I really want to talk about that I thought was cool was the setting of the book, kind of being reminiscent of the kind of Renaissance Italy and the different warring nation states that we have from like the 15th to the 17th century. As somebody that's kind of a little bit of a history nerd of those time periods, I thought this book was really cool to kind of see the comparisons that Abercrombie had with history back then that didn't really do in First Law. I thought, you know, the First Law series, Adua, and a lot of the stuff that kind of goes on around there was very kind of stock fantasy in a lot of ways, but reading that Abercrombie was inspired by things like Machiavelli, the condottieri, like the Italian mercenaries that were around back then during the Warring States period in Italy. It was really cool to see how he kind of integrated that and introduced that within the story. Next up, I thought I would do some kind of just rapid fire character reviews for the different characters within the story. I already talked about Monza Mercado, so I'll kind of go into Call Shivers. I think when you get Monza going through kind of like a pursuit to power somewhat story, and it's not exactly power she's pursuing, but she's kind of pursuing, other things that lead to power eventually. I think Call Shivers' story is a kind of cool antithesis to that in a lot of ways, where you get the kind of result of people being exploited by those who are in pursuit of power. I thought his plot line was really cool from the get-go, of just like people struggling that are just kind of forced into things that they didn't expect themselves to be doing, but didn't really have another choice. But I will say around the midpoint of the plot line, it kind of, he has a little bit of a heelish turn a little bit, where you start getting into the points where it's like, oh, is he going to betray her? Is he not going to betray her? Like when she kills the general out in the woods towards like the middle of the book. And it's kind of like one of those plot lines where they're where Abercrombie's kind of trying to lead you into thinking that maybe Call Shivers is actually trying to betray her onto the other side of the mercenaries. I just didn't buy it very well up until that point in the book. And that when it does happen later in the story, it's a little bit more believable, but I think he really tried pushing that heel turn a little bit too quickly for me. Next up, Friendly, just fun character to follow. Just some of the funniest moments in the book are just the random things that he would say when things would be happening because people are kind of caught up in what's going on. And then Friendly will just throw out like the mathematics the arithmetic that he's doing, just because he's completely just separated from everything. He doesn't really give a shit about what's going on. I think Castor Morvere's an awesome character, and probably maybe my favorite character in the story, definitely the most underrated character. He's one of those guys that it's fun to follow him, because from pretty early on in the story, Monza gets warned, like, this guy's going to betray you. And she's like, yeah, I kind of figure. And the character's kind of clued in that through Castor's perspective that he's going to betray her eventually. And it's funny to just kind of like follow him throughout the story, because you kind of grow to love all these characters, but the entire time he's just like the black sheep that nobody likes. And you get his perspective of thinking highly of himself, and then going into the whole shift through when he kills his apprentice, because he's just paranoid of everybody the entire story. And he's not so much like a one-liner guy, but I just really enjoyed his perspective, and it was just a really fun kind of switch from everything else that was going on throughout the story. Some other people, you got like Shiloh Vatari, not really a lot to work with in the story. Her, and then towards the end of the book, find out that she has children with Shank too. Up until that point, it's kind of a mystery man. Kind of like an intentional misdirection that I wasn't completely satisfied with. Kind of felt like a little bit of a waste of time in a book that really didn't need to be wasting time because it's so long. But they're fine. Not really anything specific to note about them. The Grand Duke, I liked his character a lot. Again, not a lot of development going on with him, but I think his motivations as a character, it's one of those antagonist flips where you kind of by the end of the story understand why he is the way he is, and you're sympathetic towards him right before he gets murdered. Benham Mercado, most of the background that you get on him, since he's dead for most of the story, is the beginning of each part, the backstory for Monza Mercado, and he's involved in a lot of that. I kind of was hoping, looking back, for a little bit more subtlety on how terrible of a character he is. I thought it was pretty obvious early on that he was kind of the reason that the Grand Duke tried to get them both killed in the first place. And I felt like, as somebody that was kind of supposed to be a foil for Monza's character, I kind of came out of that appreciating her character less, because it just didn't really make sense that she was unaware of how terrible her brother was and why things ended up the way they were, and how it kind of just snuck up on her. And last, you got Nika Makoska, who, one of the standout characters of the book as well. I think most people would probably say that he has the best actual individual moments in the story. Really cool seeing somebody that you got that character development as a minor character before they're hanged, and they get their moments to shine, and they kind of head off, and you're like, okay, that was a satisfying plot arc. And then you get him in a completely different perspective where he's just rock bottom at the beginning of the story, and you know the potential that he has, and gets picked up in the crew, and you just know he's like one of those people that they're always going to be around, even if they're incompetent. People just find a way sometimes, and he's like the ultimate version of that, which I think makes the moment towards, you know, the end of the second act where he dies such a impactful moment. I thought it was really well done in a series where Abercrombie doesn't really go for those types of like heartwarming moments where you see somebody like do something brave for genuinely good reasons. And I get the thematic things that Abercrombie's going for with his characters, and it's fitting in the context of the rest of the series so far why he would have this fake out death. But it really kind of killed what I felt like was a really solidly done opportunity to kind of pull off one of those moments. And I think it was, if he would have went for it and actually kept Casca dead, I think I would have respected his plot line a little bit more, especially because the latter third act plot line for Casca, while I think it's funny at times, it just didn't need to be there. And the last thing that we really have to talk about, I think the most important thing that happens in the book that you just can't end a review without discussing is just how horny this book is. I mean, he's never been afraid to write, you know, sex scenes in books up until this point, but usually they're very, you know, a little bit cringeworthy intentionally to just show how awkward it could be. But some of this stuff was getting steamy. He was really getting after it, and you gotta respect the grind. That scene with Monza and Call where, you know, you think they're with each other, but they're actually like with other people. That was one of the coolest turns that I've read in a book in a while. That was an awesome reveal. But I mean, Call, bro, I'm sorry, dude, it gets better. You all right, bro? And that'll do it for Best Served Cold. If you had anything you want to talk about, I'll be down in the comment section. If you like the video, click the like button. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. I'll see you all in the next one.